Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Complete Physio podcast. My name is Chris Myers and I'm here with Alex Quinn, who's a very experienced physiotherapist and running coach. Now, we're calling this the marathon episode because obviously we've got the marathon coming up. So we're going to start off, first of all, just talking quite generically. Can you just talk us through the different stages of a marathon training program?
Yeah, sure. I think broadly speaking, you've got 3 or 4 stages. The first stage will just depend on how fit you are when you come in, essentially, to starting your program. So if you break it into 4, you've got a base building phase where it's just about preparing your body to actually sort of begin the proper training as such. So building up an aerobic base, building up a certain number of miles or minutes on your feet per week. Once you've got that, and that phase might be sort of 4 to 6 weeks, or if you run all year round and you run 20, 30 miles a week, you probably don't need that phase.
So you can skip that phase.
But lots of people will be looking at starting this 16-week programs, or will already have started a 16-week program, and those first 4 to 6 weeks of that are probably building a bit just of endurance, basically.
Yeah.
Then you would go into sort of probably the most important sort of fundamental phase, which is going to be the phase where you do a few things. You ramp your mileage up. So you build up your running volume, potentially your frequency, your weekend long run distance. And that phase is going to continue up to relatively close to the marathon. Again, it might be a couple of months long. And in that phase, you will have specific workouts that would include perhaps a little bit of marathon pace running to start to expose your body to that. And your weekend long run and maybe some easy miles and maybe some interval type training or something like that. Then as you get nearer to the marathon, so perhaps 6 weeks out, you might go into a bit of what sometimes is called a sharpening phase, which is where you'll perhaps do your peak mileage weeks, and you'll also spend longer running at your target marathon pace. So you're really...
So you're getting a bit quicker in that.
You're starting to get a bit quicker. You're starting to see realistically, have you got yourself fit enough to attempt the time that you're thinking about taking on? Is the body feeling good? Are you able to clock however many miles per week that you are aiming for in your program? And you're sort of having a number of runs that might be 2 hours and above once a week to really get your body used to being on your feet for that long period of time, basically. And that will take you up to 2 or 3 weeks out from the marathon, where most people will begin their taper.
Yeah.
Which is the bit where people normally start to get anxious and worried because suddenly their plan drops off significantly in mileage and volume. And they start to think, well, I've done all this hard work and now I'm going to lose that fitness in the last 2 or 3 weeks because I've gone from 50 miles a week to 25 miles a week. And it just doesn't quite feel like that is what you should be doing that close to marathon. So those 4 phases, like an aerobic base building phase, and then a main block of really building your mileage, a shorter sharpening phase, really getting used to the speed you want to run at, and then a taper phase.
Cool. So let's just, because there's lots of terms there that some people may not be used to. So you've talked about sort of intervals.
Yeah.
You've talked about speed work. Can you just talk about some of those like terms that they'll see in the program that you can just explain them briefly?
So you'll see if you break that down into individual weeks, you'll see across a week, you're probably going to have a long run. That might be your Saturday or Sunday run, and that will get incrementally longer.
And is that a marathon pace?
So that's an important thing, actually. So it shouldn't be, certainly not all of it, and certainly not at the beginning of a plan. It should be slower than your marathon pace. You'll see various ways of measuring it. Some people use pace, and they might say it needs to be a minute to a minute and a half per mile slower than your marathon pace so that you're not overloading yourself. Others might go on, it needs to feel like an easy effort, like a 3 out of 10 intensity. Or it might need to be that you need to stay in a low heart rate zone or something like that, essentially.
So I suppose partly it depends how you're monitoring whether you're doing it on perceived effort or whether you've got a heart rate monitor.
Yes, exactly that. So however you're measuring it. But it on the whole, certainly to begin with, it should be an easy pace. It will still get tough because it's long, but the pace should be easy. And then nearer to the marathon, it might include some marathon pace segments. So you might have, for example, 2 hours of running, and in that 2 hours, you might have 2 lots of 20 minutes at your marathon pace.
And I assume as you get closer, you'll be doing more at marathon pace.
You'll do more and more at marathon pace. You still wouldn't do an entire, say, 20-mile run at marathon pace because it would just take you too long to recover from, and it would impair the next week or 2 of training. So long run. The other than easy runs will be just the mileage runs, which will be normally, again, at very easy paces. And that might be, depending on your frequency. Say you're running 4 times a week, you might have one other run that's just 5 or 6 miles at an easy conversational pace.
Right.
And that is just all about building your weekly volume, building your aerobic, continuing to build your aerobic base to give you the best sort of platform to then do your sort of more targeted.
And just get used to being on your feet
just being on
for
your
a
feet.
long period of
Yep.
time.
And just we know that essentially the biggest predictor of marathon time is weekly volume. So if you run more miles, on the whole, you'll run a faster marathon, essentially. Right. So those runs are there to help you build that volume, but without it all being high intensity work that is harder to recover from and will impact other sessions and things like that.
Yeah.
And then, you might have a session that is an interval or a tempo or a threshold session. And they're terms that often people will look at and go, well, what do we mean? They're essentially harder sessions. That keep it simple.
Yeah.
They're sessions where you are running at a higher level of intensity, but for shorter period of times. So intervals, exactly that. It would be maybe quite a short rep where you run quite hard. And again, how you measure that will come down to where you've got your plan and how you monitor that. But then you'll take a proper break. So you might stand and rest, or you might walk for a couple of minutes. So a classic session might be 5 reps of a mile. You do a mile effort at faster than marathon pace. So you're getting your body used to going a bit quicker. But then you take a proper recovery of maybe a 2-minute walk.
So intervals are generally quicker, but with a rest period. Quicker than marathon pace, but with a rest period.
With a rest period, exactly that.
Okay.
Tempo and threshold are essentially the same thing, and the terms get used interchangeably. And there's a lot of science you could go into, but essentially think of it, you're at a point where your body is going beyond where it's comfortable and it's moderately hard. We use these things called lactate thresholds and that. We could save that for another day to talk about. But essentially it's sort of moderately hard. But one way to think of it is your pace is a pace you could probably sustain for a maximum of an hour.
Right. Okay.
So it's not as hard as those intervals.
Yeah.
But it is hard, significantly harder than your slow, easy runs, basically. And again, you might do threshold sessions tend to be shorter blocks. So again, it might be 4 blocks of 8 minutes. And tempo sessions tend to be prescribed as longer sustained efforts. So it might be a 5-mile sustained effort that you're doing at a pace that you could continue on for the hour if you had to. And the whole idea of those sessions is to essentially improve your body's energetics, how it gets energy from various sources within the body.
Basically. So basically talking about aerobic, using oxygen and then going into more anaerobic type.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's always a sliding scale. You're always using both, but the long, slow runs should be really primarily aerobic, like 90% plus aerobic and just a little bit of anaerobic without oxygen.
Yeah.
And then your threshold and tempo work will be more the other way around, where you essentially get the energy quick enough using the body's system that uses oxygen. So you have to use a system that doesn't use oxygen, but that system can't be sustained for as long.
Yeah.
But improving that system allows us to sustain a given pace for a longer time. So it makes it easier for us to maintain our marathon pace. That's essentially what those sessions are aimed at. If we improve these thresholds, the pace that we can sustain over a 2.5 to 5 hour period becomes better, essentially, and we can run a little bit faster.
I think you explained that very well. So let's just go back to it. So basically you've gone through the structure, you've talked about the different types of training that we do, and we are actually talking about this. This is the same for an elite person, isn't it?
Yep.
As for somebody that's doing their first marathon that's never done a marathon before. And I think that's something that's important to mention, because you might go, well, all those terms, I just want to get round, I'm just doing 5 hours or 6 hours.
Yeah.
But actually the principle, it's not just about going for a run and slowly increasing how far you can run.
You're exactly right. Yeah, the basic principles are just scaled down. The elite runner is going to be running anywhere between maybe 7 and 12 runs a week. So they're going to have lots of double days and crazy mileage that most of us our bodies would just not cope with, but they've built up to that over a period of time.
Yeah.
We're just doing a scaled down version. So if you've got 4 runs a week, you can do a long run, you can do an easy run, you can do a threshold session. And then your 4th session can be optional. You might do another easy run because your body sort of is only really coping with 1 hard session a week. And that's at a novice level, absolutely, probably is enough, to be honest.
Yeah.
And if you go year after year back to the marathon and you want to get a bit faster and a bit faster, you'll essentially work gradually a bit more and more like the elites work. You'll maybe try and increase your frequency a bit.
Yeah.
Because your frequency goes up, you can now do 2 sessions a week that are of higher intensity.
Sure.
And because you've been running for longer and hopefully running injury-free, your body as a whole can tolerate more demands of higher volumes of running and more frequent running. And it's just it's a very gradual, fulfilling process if you stick with it over a period of time.
Yeah.
I completely understand there'll be people that have signed up for one. When they've done the one, they are done, and that's fine. Basically,
that was me.
If you just
2003.
so if you just want to
my
tick
one
that
and only
box
marathon
and do it once, I guess for me, you want to, if you're going to do it once, that's absolutely fine as well. But you want to be able to enjoy as much of it as possible.
Yeah.
And the more prepared you are, the more. No one will say the last 5 miles of a marathon are enjoyable.
No.
But whether you sort of really struggle from 5 miles out or from 15 miles out makes a massive difference to your overall experience, basically. So those principles apply. Whether you're first marathon, fifth marathon, elite, sub-elite, complete novice, you can.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So let's say somebody's doing their first marathon, but we can obviously compare it to somebody that's done, say, 3 or 4 marathons. It's quite a difficult question, but how far out should your training start?
Yeah.
Answer that first. The second question will be, you see programs where they're running 4 times a week. You see programs where they're running 6 times a week.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that as well? So first of all, how far out should you start?
I think the how far out's really interesting. The classic online program you'll download or get from London Marathon's website will be 16 weeks. And I don't know where that number came from, but it just is. And it sort of works. You sort of have 4 to 6 week base, 7 or 8 weeks in the middle, and then a taper, basically. And for most people, that will be okay. But if you're coming into that off of no running, that's probably not long enough.
No.
Because week 1 is going to have somewhere between 20 and 40 kilometers or 15.
That's
or
a big jump from sitting on a couch to.
It's a huge jump. So for that person, you might say, realistically, if that's the program you're going to take on, you need another 4 to 8 weeks before that. Forget the program. Just get yourself used to running.
And that could just be as simple as doing the couch to 5K.
Exactly that. I think you've got to get yourself. For me, couch to 5K would be a great start. Then you might they do a 5 to 10K program as well. You might do that. And I think if you can run 10K reasonably comfortably, that gives you a nice base to then take on a 16-week program. There will be plenty of people out there that will take on a 12-week program or a 14-week program. And if you're writing your own, there's no set amount. It doesn't have to be. But I think if you are, like I said, if you're running sort of 30K plus a week consistently, then you're ready to start probably a 16-week program. If you're running maybe 40 or 50K a week, then you could probably look at a shorter program of maybe 12 to 14 weeks.
And obviously lots of people on the London Marathon, it is their first, and they're not runners generally. And I think that's the problem, isn't it, with the general programs, is it gives you this impression that anybody can do a marathon in 16 weeks. But it's very different if you've never run before. And obviously we in the clinic, we see loads of these injuries. First-time runners, they start it in December sometime, first week of January, they're booking in with a knee problem. Because they've just upped their mileage too quickly.
Just too quickly. And you're right. I think the reality is for every person that you see on that start line who coped with the 16-week program, clinics like ours have probably seen 2 or 3 people that didn't cope with that program, basically. And then frequency. So I would say it will be for novices somewhere between 3 and 6 runs a week, really. And I do think you can train for a marathon of 3 runs a week, but I wouldn't necessarily, personally, I wouldn't advise it. And my reasoning for that is your week will look like 2 midweek runs of between 5 and 10K on most plans, and then an ever-increasing weekend long run, which at some point essentially might be up towards 30K, which means you're doing 60% of your weekly mileage. Let's say you do 10K Tuesday, 10K Thursday, and 30K
on one day. You're doing a huge amount.
You're doing 60% of your mileage. And as a general rule of thumb, your long run should maybe make up about 30 to 40% of your weekly mileage. There's no real research behind that.
Sure.
Just a bit of a
but from your experience of coaching
people.
It's
just a coaching rule of thumb. So there are ways you get around that. Some people's bodies don't cope with doing longer or more runs. So they might do a mixture of cross training. So you might do 3 runs, a bike, and a cross trainer session. And at least you're still getting some aerobic work and you're building that energy system. But I think if you can cope with 4 or 5, and that's one of the early things to prepare for as well, is if you're looking at a plan that's going to run 5 times a week, you need to start preparing your body for 5 times a week. There's no point doing 2 runs a week in the build-up and then suddenly jump into a plan that's 5 runs a week, because it's, again, a huge shock to the body. So I think 4 or 5 runs would allow you to prepare really well for a marathon. But like I said, you can get there on 3, and some people will obviously do more. But I think if you're at that lower end, supplementing it with cross training is probably a way to keep your sort of workload high, so your weekend.
And certainly if you start 20 weeks out, that just sort of little and often
Yep.
can be a really sort of good start for it. And the thing is, what you're saying there in terms of how many runs you do, you know, some of those, I remember when I was doing it, some of the runs, like on a Tuesday night, was just a 3K run,
Yep.
you know,
Yeah.
just slightly quicker than marathon pace. But every, you know, every training that you do or every session you do does have a role, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it should do.
It
Yeah,
should have a
you
role.
should understand that in your plan as well. Why
Yeah.
am I doing this session?
Yeah.
Why am I dragging myself out on a Tuesday night for just a few kilometers when I'm training for 42? You need to understand what that is. And like I said, that was a faster run. So that's about developing a different energy system, essentially. So having that understanding helps you buy into your program as well. So
you've alluded to, what I want to go on to now is other types of training. So we've talked a lot about running.
Yeah.
But we know that it's not just about running. So you've already talked about cross training, you've talked about bike.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, first of all, around strength training, because I think that's a big thing that we often talk about.
Yeah.
How on earth do you fit strength training when you're doing 5 runs a week? Like, where does this fit in?
Where does it go? Well, I think the first thing is strength training is every runner's nemesis. They just, if they can avoid it, they will.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting one because if you really dig into the research on it, we haven't really got solid proof that it prevents injuries yet. We've got from team sports, there's some new stuff out literally this week that says if you do regular supervised strength training, you perhaps do reduce your running related injury risk.
Right, yeah.
But where it does where there's no question about what it benefits is performance.
Yeah.
So if you do consistent strength training for a block of maybe beyond 8 weeks, certainly the longer the better.
Yeah.
Your running economy improves. How easy it is for you to sustain a pace improves by between 2 and 8%. So if you think super shoes are about 4%, and then if you added in another 4 to 8% off of strength training, you're laughing really.
Yeah, yeah.
But like you said, most people they'll start it with all good intentions, and then as their mileage cranks up and they're tired, it's the first thing to go basically. So the first thing I would say is keep it simple.
Yeah. And
the classic mistake is people have big long programs, high volumes of exercise, so they're doing like 3 or 4 sets of 15, and actually the research suggests actually going a little bit heavier and doing less sets and reps, or certainly less
Is this
reps.
During the 20-16 week phase, or is this before?
I think if you can do it before, great, because then you can just do some maintenance work of maybe just once a week, in your when you're in your higher volume weeks.
Yeah.
But most people are going to want to take it on at least a bit alongside. And I tend to say, look, if you can just fit in 2 20-minute sessions, it doesn't need to be a lot. If you've got the gym, great. If you haven't, get an adjustable set of dumbbells or a couple of kettlebells at home so you can add a bit beyond body weight, essentially, and just pick some key exercises.
Simple things, squats,
so
lunges.
Squat, lunge, a hinge,
calf,
some sort
raises.
of calf, definitely some calf work. Yeah. And then maybe just a little bit of core and upper body. So you might just pick 5 exercises.
Yeah.
And you might say, I'm going to do those 5 exercises. I'm going to do 3 or 4 sets of 6 to 8 reps, so lower numbers. And I'm just going to be progressive with that. So every couple of weeks, I'm going to add a little bit more resistance.
Yeah. So you're not increasing because that's the other thing. This needs to be banged out in 20, 30 minutes max, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So you don't want to be just increasing your volume.
No. And the volume just leads to more fatigue, longer recovery times. Yes, you can get other strength benefits, but you have to think you're in the middle of a marathon training program. Yeah. And then where to put it? Well, there's this old adage of keep the hard days hard and the easy days easy. So you could say, okay, on my session day where I'm doing either intervals or threshold, I'm also going to strength train on that day. But in an ideal world, they'd be separated.
Yeah.
So you might do your run in the morning, and then at least 4 to 6 hours later, you might do your strength work, basically. And we'd all love to have this ideal world, but sometimes that's just not there.
Yeah, you've got to
so
work
if you have
in
to do it at the same, if you have to do it at the same time, I would always, in my opinion, do run first, then strength.
Yeah,
There's other people that might argue around tendon and bony adaptation.
Yeah, I'd say unless you're a trained athlete, then you definitely want to be doing the running first.
Yeah, because the fatigue from the strength is going to impact the run for me more than the run's going to impact the strength.
Yeah.
So that's the way I know. That's my personal preference. Yeah. And then if you can, if you can do your 1 or 2 strength sessions on run days, and you're running 5 days a week, you still then have 2 recovery days, where you can absolutely take them very easy.
Yeah.
Sleep, eat, rest.
Yeah.
Do whatever else you want to do.
So I suppose the other way of doing it is that you run, and then on the day you're not running, that you do your strength training.
Yeah.
But you generally favour a complete day off.
If I can, definitely. Yeah. If someone's only training 3 or 4 times a week, then they can strength train on a day off of their running and still have 1 or 2 days of rest. So they can fit it in differently. Yeah. But the minute you hit sort of 5 runs a week, you're probably needing to have at least one day where you strength and run. So make sure you've got at least one full day of rest.
Fine.
Basically.
So basically, if you can start strength training before your marathon run, your running starts. If you're new to it, that will give you a really good baseline, I assume.
Yes.
And then, but there's no doubt that as your running goes up, your strength training needs to become more efficient. Probably needs to become shorter, and potentially you're still doing the heavy weights. But you're just doing less of it. So as you're getting 2 weeks before the marathon, there's not going to be huge amounts of strength training.
No, once we're into that taper period, I would taper the strength in the same way I taper the running. So, okay, we're going to take 40 or 50% of it away, and that's probably going to be in reps as opposed to weight. Because actually, if I'm just doing like 3 sets of 4, I'm going to maintain a really nice strength stimulus without any real fatigue from that, basically. So yeah, that's exactly how I do it, basically.
And also, it's a bit strength training. You know, from an evidence point of view, is similar to running. People panic when they taper that, well, in 2 weeks I'm going to lose everything. It's the same with strength. We know we can hang on to strength quite well, but even just a very small dose of strength really maintains strength for longer, doesn't it? So
and you might 6 weeks out, 8 weeks out say, actually, I'm just going to strength train once a week now because I need those extra recovery.
But we know it can maintain
it will maintain it quite nicely. And then when you've recovered from your marathon and you're deciding what you're going to do next, you could then say, I'm going to do another block of more intense strength training while I'm not running so much. And really build a bit more strength ready for whatever you're going to take on.
I suppose, obviously, as physios, I'm just thinking about some of the patients I've seen this week. There's also that thing where if you have had previous injury, it's probably worth getting that checked out 2 months before you even start your training, because we would be able to then give a specific rehab program to try and prevent that pain coming on when they start running.
Yeah, I think
that would be ideal, wouldn't it?
It would be ideal. If you've got the means to do that, I think it'd be ideal, because you could, like I said, we know that, again, if you're choosing your strength plan, it would be useful to target previous injured areas and sort of try and make them a bit more resilient. And in clinic these days, we have the ability to test. We can look at individual muscle strength. We can look at force plate data. So we can look at whole leg strength, and we can say, actually, although that injury was 9 months ago, you're still quite a bit weaker on that side than the other. So let's definitely work on that in the run up before you start your plan. So if you can, I would 100% recommend something like that.
And that links us in really nicely to why people come to see us, which is they have pain. Now, if you're going to train for a marathon, you're going to get pain at some point. There's no doubt about it. But what I'm really interested in from your experience is, what are the pains that people should be concerned about, and what are the ones that they can ignore? So if we talk about the ones they should be concerned about, that will probably take care of the other part.
It will do, yeah. So I have a few sort of guidelines, that we call them, that I would say. Some of it comes from things like tendon research. So the classic things with tendons, and you could say sort of low level other soft tissue injuries, is if you've got a pain that is very low level, if you use a classic 0 to 10 scale, it's sort of 2 out of 10 pain. And it doesn't stay there for a whole run. Maybe it warms up and it doesn't linger into the next day. And you're monitoring it, it's not getting any worse. We can keep going with that, basically. But the minute you're sort of seeing, actually, this is spiking, I'm now getting more significant pain, or I run on a Monday, I'm still aware of this pain by Wednesday, for me, that's a sort of little flag saying that's probably something you want to go and get checked out sooner rather than later. I think if you have a pain that's quite sharp or catching in nature, I think those sorts of pains are a little bit more sort of bell ringing than sort of the lesser sort of more just niggles and dull aches and things like that. I think if you have a pain that's very much impact related, so on every time your foot strikes the ground, you're getting a very significant, consistent pain.
And that gets worse as you run.
That builds and gets worse, and then maybe sort of lingers for a while afterwards. And it feels not, often those sorts of pains, we're maybe looking at towards maybe bone stress type injuries. They don't feel right. People tell us they don't feel right. But people will often try and ignore them for a couple of weeks before they go, actually, now this was sort of only getting up to a mild awareness, and now it's quite significant when I run, and it's there for the entirety of the run.
And then now I'm limping afterwards.
So that leads straight to the next thing. If you have a pain that makes you in any way change your normal running style, I think you should get it checked. So if you notice you're chopping your stride down, you're shifting your weight from your heel more to your midfoot, you're running sort of with you're having to take a longer or a shorter stride to try and manipulate that pain. I think you're already at a stage where you're trying to work around something that is probably not going to get better unless you go and get it looked at. So anything that's sort of, impact related pain that's getting worse, pain that's regularly above a 3 out of 10 that takes a long time to settle into the next day and the day after, and anything that sort of makes you chop and change how you're running, I think those things need to be sort of looked at sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Because most people have the challenge with treating runners is they all come in with obviously with marathon runners, they come in with their deadline.
Yeah.
And my deadline is this race on this date. So we need to be better as soon as possible.
And every day that's going, they're getting more anxious because they're missing training sessions and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think I had a patient who came in on Monday with foot pain from running. And they did have a stress fracture. They're not actually training for this marathon, but they're running they run very regularly. But they increase their running. And I always have this phrase: if I'm treating a runner, it's a stress fracture until proven otherwise. And stress fractures definitely build, don't they? Sometimes you can have an incident, but generally they build. And every run, you run on a Monday, you run on a Wednesday, and it's a bit better at the beginning, but then it builds and then it gets a bit worse and then it doesn't settle down in between. And I think the important thing is if you press a bone and it really hurts, then you should definitely get it checked out. And this person was fully aware that they may have a stress fracture because they'd had one on the other side, but they kept running. And actually there's a stage before a stress fracture, which is a stress reaction, where if you stop running, even just for 2 weeks, it won't develop into a stress fracture. So I think that's good advice, because it may not progress on, but if you just keep ignoring it and don't get the right information, and if you see physios that know what they're doing and see lots of runners, that's often at the top of our mind, isn't it? Is this a stress fracture?
Yeah, and it can be really, really frustrating because you're often trying to train for an event. But the thing to remember is, if you end up having something that does need a couple of weeks rest just to give it a chance to really settle, maybe with a bit of rehab alongside it, depending on the type of injury, often these people can still cross train. They can still get on a bike or in a pool or on a cross trainer or do something. And with running a distance event like a marathon, it's just about building the minutes, really. So if you have to do a couple of weeks and it's boring, but all your time is on the bike, but you still do 4 hours a week on that bike, your fitness is not going to suffer very much at all, if at all. You'll feel rusty when you first go running again, but your fitness will be okay.
And a good physio will not just say stop everything, because there's very few injuries where even with a stress fracture, you may take a week off, but then you can start getting into the pool and that sort of thing. So my next question leads on quite nicely, really, which is, you've talked about cycling, you've talked about cross trainer, and I can think of one patient that I saw that was doing that for about 6 weeks before I saw them. And they had just lost too much time. They didn't have enough time on their feet to be able to do the marathon. They unfortunately had to pull out, and I wish they'd come a lot earlier. But how much benefit is cross trainer and cycling and swimming to performance in a marathon?
So really quickly, interestingly, swimming doesn't seem to have as much carryover. So if you take people who are injured and can't run, and some of them cycle and some of them swim, the cyclists will do better. Doesn't mean you can't swim.
No.
But it perhaps won't be quite as effective as doing something else. But it might be the only thing you can do. With the type of injury, might be actually the only thing you can really do is get in the water for complete non-weight bearing, and that's fine. If that's all you can do, always focus on what you can do. I think it can have a really good role if you use it as you need to. And what I mean by that is, you need to sort of match your sessions. If you have to shift onto a bike or you're adding bike work in, again, what's the goal of the session? So if the goal is just to maybe replace that 5 mile Monday run because you're a bit tired and achy, then 5 miles on a bike will only take you like 15 minutes. So you need to switch it for time and say, okay, 5 miles was going to take me 40 minutes. So I need to be on that bike for 40 minutes. And I need to feel like the intensity matches the intensity of me running, which often means going a little bit harder on a bike to reach that sort of heart rate level and things like that. You can, interval sessions, switch onto the bike really nicely. But again, it's harder to get heart rate zones as high. So you have to work a bit harder. And if you're not used to it, it can take a little bit of getting used to. So it won't give you the benefits of sort of musculotendinous, muscle tendon, bone adaptations, because you're not getting the impact, you're not having to absorb the forces. But from an energy systems, aerobic capacity, cardiovascular system, it's a really, really useful swap out, and you can maintain, done well. And that's the thing, people just often pay it lip service. They're like, I'll just go do half an hour on the bike. Their session should have been
Yeah.
90 minutes long,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
after half an hour they're bored, so they get off.
Yeah.
And they don't get what they were going to get from that run session in any format. They don't get the impact, but they also don't get the aerobic work. So it's like I said before, it can be a bit torturous.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do it. You can always take a step back and go, maybe this time is not for me, and I'll go away and work on some things and come back. But most people wouldn't
keep
do
going,
that. They want to be on the start line.
I don't care if I walk it, I'm going to do the marathon.
Yeah, so they want to be there.
Yeah.
So for me, it's matching the quality and the intensity that you need to get. If you can do that, I think it has really good value.
Cross trainer or bike?
I think cross trainer or bike would be the two I'd go for.
What would you go for?
I tend to put people on the bike just because it's easier, you can control it a bit better. I think it's easier to get the intensity on the bike. But if people are really used to cross trainers, that's fine. You can get these weird outdoor bikes now that look like a cross trainer.
Yeah, really
so
weird.
They look really weird, but I've seen a few elite athletes and sub-elite athletes using those now, so they're not. Because again, the boredom.
I hope they got them for free.
I'd hope they do as well.
They look very odd.
It's the boredom thing, isn't it? So if you can go around a park doing it, you're still getting that outdoor element of running.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
But they do look ridiculous.
They do look very silly. So let's say you've had an injury, which, let's be honest, people have, niggles as they go. You've missed 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Panic, you've got $5,000 of charity money, if you complete it. Like, how do you cope with catching up in your running program, or can you not?
I think the first thing is, I think once you go over, if you're missing 2 or 3 weeks out of a 16-week program, you have missed about 20%. That starts to become reasonably significant.
Yeah, and I've read things where above 20% is reconsider,
so exactly
depending on what you want to achieve.
So the first thing I would be saying is, what was the goal? Was the goal, like I said, just to raise the money for the charity? And yes, you would have liked to achieve the set time, but can we just revise that time down and say, would it be the end of the world if you were 15 minutes slower?
Yeah.
Because realistically, to get yourself back to where you were, it's going to be a bit risky. It's not impossible, but it's going to elevate the risk of pushing
more
you
chance
a bit
of you
harder.
not getting to the start line.
And we know one of the biggest risk factors for injury is previous injury, especially in a short space of time. So I think you really have to sometimes just look at your goal and say, what was my goal? A classic mistake is people trying to play catch up.
Yeah.
So they will just jump back into their plan.
Double the training sessions
they'll
in
do
1
more
week.
sessions. They might try and just jump in at the long run that they should have been at, and that means the last long run they did was 10 miles.
Yeah.
The next one on their plan is 18, and they just jump in at 18.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just got to go back and say, you also, if you had a plan for a 3-week taper, you could often, if you then miss some training, your body's not going to be globally as fatigued. So you could always get a week back in your taper and change your taper to 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Because tapers can be anything from sort of 10 days to 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So, and everybody's different.
Yeah.
And you might know what your body's coped with before. But there's potential to get 1 week back by having a slightly later taper period. So there are ways and means, but I would say the biggest pitfalls are not being willing to budge on your goals. Yeah. And then because of that, pushing yourself too hard.
So say you get injured in week 14 and you've had 2 weeks off, you go straight to week 16 and just do that session.
Yeah, and that's where people will make the mistakes and things like that. So, and don't forget, you're not going to lose huge amounts in 2 or 3 weeks. You're going to use a bit. You are definitely going to lose a bit. There's Jack Daniel's running formula, which is one of the sort of original Bibles of running.
Yeah.
And he suggests sort of week 1, you lose roughly 1% of fitness. Right. Week 2 goes up to about 3%, and then it does start to rise relatively exponentially after that. So 2 weeks is, for me, not a disaster at all.
But for an elite, obviously, that 1% could be the difference.
Well, that's the thing, If someone's trying to run sort of a really fast sub 220 or something, that's probably going to mean for them they need to look at that and go, well, I can give it a go, but on the day I need to recognise if my body's not there. And just be willing to back off.
Now, what's your thoughts? I was going to talk about this earlier, but it sort of comes up now in terms of setting yourself a goal.
Yeah.
So whether it's 7 hours, 6 hours, sub 3, 3.5, whatever, are you a believer that, you should be setting a goal at the beginning, or do you need to, or can you just see how it goes? Or?
Yeah. I don't think you have to set one at the beginning. Some people find them really motivational. They're like, I know I want to run the marathon. I want to break 4. 4 seems to be the new 20-minute 5K is the 4-hour marathon now. I want to break 4. And if they have it right from the off, it gives them sort of that motivation. What it sometimes also does, it means you're running your early runs a bit too fast because you sort of constantly want to try and test yourself at that 4-hour pace.
Yeah.
And remember, you're trying to be fit enough to run 4 hours in that week of the marathon.
Yeah.
You are not going to be fit enough to run that 4 hours in week 3. So those paces are not quite right for you there. So you need to scale it back a bit and say, okay, well, maybe I should be running currently when I'm doing my marathon pace work at like 4:15 pace. So that's a bit slower. So I think goals can be useful, but I don't think there's a rush to set one early.
No.
I think there's most people will run, and I would recommend running another event in the build up for lots of reasons: preparation, practice, fueling practice, mental practice, all those different things.
I think that's real. I did that. I did a half marathon a few months out, and just going there, getting ready, getting a bit nervous, getting your food ready the day before, making sure, you know, when you take your gel packs, you don't vomit straight away with certain things. I thought that was a really
So it's really great practice, but it also gives you a benchmark. So let's say you go and run a 2-hour half marathon, and that half marathon is about 6 or 8 weeks out from your marathon.
Yeah.
Realistic. If that was an all-out effort, then maybe that 4 hours isn't realistic then, because you're not going to do those back to back. Even with another 6 weeks training, you maybe you could, but it's a push. So what it gives you, that's maybe the time to set your goal. Okay, and there are all sorts of calculators online that will normally they just
as in if you do a half, or a 10K in this, then you
and the nearer it is the distance, the more accurate it tends to be. So a half is better at predicting a marathon than a 10K. But a 10K is okay. A 5K is probably not a great predictor of your marathon time, basically.
So if you've done a half in, say, 2 hours, what would it predict roughly?
So
because you can't just double it, obviously.
No, it's on average, it's sort of roughly double plus about 10%. So you might be then looking like 4:15 or something like that, basically. And I think that's realistic. And then, but I don't necessarily think the first time marathon always needs to even have a time. Almost everyone wants one. But my first marathon, I actually wish I didn't have a time because I got it all wrong on the day. The time was unrealistic. I went far too fast. I absolutely blew up in the second half of the marathon, and it was a miserable experience from about mile 14 onwards. So 12 miles of misery. And actually, if I'd have just gone there with, trained, unprepared, I'll get round today. And I didn't do a race in the build up either because I can't remember why. I think I had a newborn son, so there wasn't really much time to get out. So I didn't really have a good predictor of where I was at. But basically,
and then you just went for it.
So I just went for it on the day and absolutely capitulated. Basically,
I'm sure you learned a lot from doing it.
Well, I did learn a lot, and then the next marathon I did over half an hour quicker. So you do learn from. But if it's your first time, you might say, okay, well, I'll have a loose time goal. But actually,
because you do need an ish time goal, don't you, to actually get your training program?
You need that, and you also need it to make sure you just don't go out far too fast. If you haven't got a clue where you're going to be, very easy to get drawn into the adrenaline on the day, and just be like whoosh off the line. You get 5 miles in, and there's this rule of thumb thing that says for every second you go too fast in the first 10K, you'll give back 4 seconds in the last 10K. So if you run through that first 10K 3 minutes too quick, you're giving back at least 12 minutes in the last 10K, basically.
Yeah, there's a lot to you've got to run with a watch on. So I ran around with one of the guys with the 4-hour marker on his back, and I knew if I just finished in front of him,
you'd be ahead of 4 hours.
I was under 4 hours.
Yeah, and those guys take all the leg work out of it for you in terms of thinking while you're running. You can just try and
enjoy the day.
And enjoy the day. And that's always the thing, especially if you're doing a big marathon where the crowds are huge, the whole thing's an event. There's so much value to be just saying, look, go there and actually experience it first time. And then if you want to do it again, you've then got a marker to say, okay, I did that. Now I want to go to this time. And then you can start to say, okay,
it's such a good day when we had a really nice sunny day for it. And you're running around, you've got the crowds, everybody's smiling at you. You've got to have your name on your front. People, it's a great feeling.
Yeah, it really is.
Unless you do what you did.
Mine was a
Did you get round?
I got round, but I purely finished because there was no quicker way back to the car park than to go through the finish line. Otherwise, I'd have quit. I've never quit a race. But I think I would have quit that day because I just, I more than hit the wall. But I had to walk through the finish line on the way to the car park, so I thought I might as well finish.
Cool, let me take you back because what I know you've recently done a marathon as well. I want to go a month or 3 weeks before the marathon. So you've done your long run. And I'll be interested to know what you think about what a long run needs to be. And when it needs to be. And then I want to talk about the taper. So we'll talk about 3 weeks before. Then I want to take you a week before. What should we be doing? What we should definitely not be doing. And then we're going to do 24 hours before, and then we'll talk about the race day itself. So let's first of all talk about when should you do your long run and how long should your final long run be?
So for most, that your peak weeks, which will include your long run, will be sort of 3 to 5 weeks out from the marathon. And often people will do their longest run just before their taper starts, which kind of makes sense because you're going to really push
It's like
your
a
body.
celebration.
Yeah, you're going to push your body, you're going to do that long run, and then you instantly are going to start dropping your volume down.
And I'm assuming the long run at this point will be at marathon pace.
So not all of it.
No.
I would still be saying you might have, I don't know, let's say your long run is, we'll talk about this in a minute, but let's say your long run is 18 miles.
Yeah.
And you might say, okay, well, I'm going to do maybe a half marathon at marathon pace. So I'll do a few miles warm up, a few miles cool down.
Yeah.
And in the middle, I'm going to do a half marathon at marathon pace.
Yeah.
There's just not really much added benefit for doing more than that. And there are, which will link nicely onto how long it should be, there are maybe more detrimental effects of pushing your body for longer at that pace. Yeah. So how long should your long marathon run? So lots of people want it to be a set number of miles, 18, 20, 22. Most people will be in that range. Yeah. I cap people at 3 hours.
Right.
And sometimes I might cap them even a bit less than that, depending on how.
Even if they're doing a 5 hour?
Even if they're doing, and the people look at you and go, I absolutely need to be running longer than that. And I would never stop someone running longer. No. I would just explain my reasoning and then we'd decide together, basically. My reasoning is sort of a law of diminishing benefits, essentially. So the energy systems benefits you get from doing your long run, so the ability to burn fat as a fuel, the ability to sort of keep your lactate in control, things like that, sort of peak at 90 minutes. Right. And then they don't really change after that. So you still get benefits, but there's not, from an energy system perspective, there's not a great deal difference between a 90-minute run and a 2-hour run and a 2.5-hour run, and so on and so forth. But what there is gradually increasing stress and strain on the body.
Right.
So a 3.5 to 4 hour run is going to take your body significantly longer to recover from. You're going to have more muscular fatigue, more tendon fatigue, more bony overload, which you probably can cope with. But if the only thing you're getting is negatives and no additional training benefit, why there's no reason to go above.
Sure, yeah.
The problem for a lot of people is that 3 hours might cap them at sort of 15 miles.
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, I've got to run 26.
Yeah.
So I want to know. So from a psychological perspective,
mentally,
there's massive value to going longer. Yeah. And if the person really wants to go longer, we'll talk about, okay, well, how can we make that work? It might just be that we say, look, as a one-off, we're going to do 18 to 20 miles. Yeah. So one-off and keep it nice and steady. We wouldn't put maybe much marathon pace in that because it's going to be hard anyway. And we're going to keep it nice and steady. Other ways around that, and things I often tell people is, don't forget that if you run your long run on a Sunday, you've got a week's fatigue in your legs from that week already. So when you start your marathon, your legs should be fresh and you are starting from mile 0. But doing your long run on a Sunday after doing already 30 kilometers that week, the fatigue in your legs is maybe the equivalent of starting from mile 8.
So it doesn't actually even reflect the marathon anyway. It's more than that in a way.
Exactly that. So it might be that if we say you're starting from mile 8 in your long run, then actually running 15 miles takes you to mile 23. We've done more than enough. Or if we really want to make sure that fatigue is there, we might say, okay, if your long run's on a Sunday, Saturday evening, you're going to run a relatively hard 5 miles. We're going to put that fatigue in the legs. And then on Sunday morning, you're going to get up and do your 3 hours. And you're going to know right from the off, you're already a little bit tired. So that almost gives us the first hour done. And we don't have to do quite so much.
So after my initial, you can't do just 3 hours. You've actually explained it there that I can see the benefit in doing that. But I assume it will come down to the individual. It will come down to how successful they've been in their training program so far, whether they've got any niggles.
It's what you think they can cope with. It's a joint decision. And don't get me wrong, I think psychologically, knowing when you get to mile 20 in the marathon, knowing you've been there before has massive value. And some people really need that. And others are not so worried about that because they sort of feel in that 3 hour run, they know once they get into a rhythm, they can just keep. They can keep like chugging that out at that pace and the way they go, basically.
Because even in when I remember doing, I think I did 21 miles or something like that, and I still remember feeling anxious that I'd never actually done the marathon distance. So actually, in a way, it doesn't matter if you did 18 or 21, you're still going to feel like
everyone has it. You go into those sort of that last. There's lots of people say that marathon's a 20-mile warm up and then a 6-mile race, and it's sort of it is that last 6 miles is the bit where mentally and physically you're going to be in probably a pretty dark place. And hopefully you've prepped well enough that you are going to be able to come out of that reasonably well. But also keep in mind it's supposed to be really hard at that point. That's a bit that people, when you get expectation violation, that you're thinking, I thought the adrenaline would carry me through. There's a good chance it won't on anyone's marathon at any point in that point. So if you are really expecting to feel good and you don't, that can actually add to the distress of it. So
Yeah.
if you in your mind prepare that this is going to get tougher and tougher,
Yeah.
and that's normal,
Yeah.
and I'm ready for this because I've done the work,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not such a shock when
No.
it comes, basically.
No, you got to prepare yourself, don't you? Okay, so I've just done my 20, or I've done my long run. Let's say we got 3 weeks out.
Yeah.
How do I spend those next 3 weeks?
Yeah, so you're into your taper. So there's a few things. It is about optimizing. So we know that if you do a taper well, you get a vast array of improvements. You get improvement in muscle power, muscle function, aerobic function, cardiovascular function, nervous system function. If you do it right, there's potentially a sort of 3% gain in race performance to be had, basically. Which, if you're running a 5-hour marathon, is a significant amount of time of a 5-hour marathon. So the sort of probably the key thing with tapers, and people are becoming generally a little bit more aware, is the thing that you reduce is your volume. And over those 2 or 3 weeks, whatever you choose, you're probably going to reduce your overall weekly mileage or volume by about 40 to 60%. So it's quite significant. So if you've gone from 50-mile weeks, 3 weeks out, sort of coming up to a week out, you might only be running 25 miles, something like that. But you do need to keep stimulating your body. So frequency can stay roughly the same. So if you were doing 4 runs a week, you can still do 4 runs a week. You could choose to say, actually, I don't need 4, I'll do 3. I might do 3 and go for a swim. Now swimming would be good. Or a bike. And intensity needs to stay in there. Because that's what sort of keeps providing the stimulus so that you don't detrain. You don't start. So
you need the speed.
So you still need some speed work, and that might be just once or twice a week having some speed work in a session,
like an
interval session, and maybe some marathon pace work.
But the intervals will be shorter than what you were doing.
Yeah, the total volume of them would probably drop. So if early in the marathon you might be doing that 5 times a mile session, you might just do 3 times a mile, but the pace would still be as you need it, but you've just got less reps essentially. And your long run at the weekend might drop down. Sort of say you did 20, you might then do 10 to 12, you might then do sort of 6 to 8. But again, in there, definitely would be having some marathon pace work so that we sort of keep that coming. And then that would take us sort of up to a week out, basically.
Okay. And so we're now a week out. Tell us a bit about starting to mentally prepare for the race, because that is probably, if you've done your training, you cannot really get any more physical gains, can you? But you can definitely start, and you should be working on this anyway, but working on the mental side of things.
Yeah, and like I said, you can be working on this all the way through.
Yeah.
But there's loads of little tips and tricks, and there's a really good book by Steve Magnus called Do Hard Things. I'd definitely recommend reading that, because he's a runner but talks about the psychology of doing tough things. But so some of the things that I would use, and some other things I've picked up from some of his stuff as well. So even some things like visualization, it might sound corny, might be cheesy, but picturing yourself.
So I walked some of the route the day before. Sorry, the week before. Not a long walk, because I didn't want to be walking around much. But I walked the cobbles around the Tower of London.
And you sort of just imagine yourself coming through there and feeling strong and doing that. So visualization, I think, is really, really useful. Knowing you've prepared, so just positive self-talk, both in the build-up and during, we know has a massive effect. So, and actually talking to yourself in the second or third person seems to be better than in the first person. So rather than while you're running saying, I can do this, saying you can do this, or Chris, you can do this, seems, I don't know why,
I do it every
day.
Seems
to be a little bit better.
I can do this, Chris, I can do this.
But practice maybe 2 or 3 mantras that are super quick for you to say that you will be comfortable saying out loud. Be amazed how many people are talking to themselves in a marathon. That you're comfortable saying that you find motivational for you. So some people
or relaxing. It could be something that
in the runs, in the build-up, I would practice having both an extrinsic and an intrinsic focus. So sometimes novice runners tend to be very intrinsic. So while they run, they spend the whole time thinking about their body. And it's why sort of they like to put music in or something to distract them generally. And what that means is as soon as you start to get aches and niggles, which are going to happen on race day, you start to worry, you start to become a bit anxious. And it just adds to the sort of stress of running the marathon. Whereas elite runners can tune in and out. So they might think about their running for a bit. Is my form good? What's my pace like? How am I feeling? And then they'll zone out a little bit, and they might just follow the person's shoes in front. Or they might sort of have a little bit of observing the crowd or something that takes them away from their body. which is not easy to do when everything's hurting.
No.
But you can practice it in training. And if
Yeah.
you sort of say, okay, well, if I'm doing runs in small groups,
Yeah.
maybe I will practice just for a while, trying to just focus on the person in front's like foot strike, or even my own, just the sound of it.
Would it help knowing, like, mile 13 is London Bridge, Tower Bridge, or like so landmarks as you're
chunking,
going?
exactly that, and sort of having lots of people now get like over right in their arm, or they get the stickers that have their splits, because around London and lots of marathons you lose your GPS and your timing's all out. That can be worrying as well. But yeah, exactly. Breaking the race up into manageable chunks.
Even writing motivational stuff on. I mean,
I sometimes get people to write their total mileage they did in their training.
Oh, that's nice.
So as a little sort of, you've done 2,000 miles to prepare for this.
Don't panic.
The 26 miles is the victory lap, basically. You could have one motivational quote,
like that.
and you sort of, so you're prepared. But then breaking the race. Exactly. If you know London, and even if you don't, you could say, well, I'm going to break this down into 5 rounds of 5 miles.
You do it on Google Earth. You almost don't need to go there anymore, do you?
Exactly that. And it's going to be 5 rounds of 5 miles. That gets me to mile 25.
In fact, there are YouTube videos of people going round, so you could actually see it,
And if you break that down, rather than thinking, oh, it's miles to the mile, you think, okay, right, I've got 3 miles. Next bit takes me to Limehouse Bridge or whatever. And then next bit takes me to Tower Bridge. Then next bit takes me to Canary Wharf. And I'm just doing those bits at a time. So basically starting to prepare those strategies.
As you said, visualization is where we started that.
I think so a big one, visualization, positive self-talk, mantras, anything like that, chunking the race. And even in the bit before, we talked about expectation violation, sort of being realistic with how it's going to be on the day. And not sort of going in all sort of roses and saying, okay, well, I've done the training, this will be a breeze. If it is, it's a lovely, pleasant surprise, basically. But if it isn't, the shock of it can really throw people off, and they sort of start to I feel terrible, I can't catch my breath, my legs are aching. They start to panic. But if you say to yourself, no, this is 20 miles, this is what I expected now. And
other things that I've noticed, I remember there's one patient that said to me, oh, I've got my week before the marathon sorted, I've got the week off work. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, because if you're feeling a bit anxious, and then all you end up doing, a bit like you're saying about intrinsic, extrinsic, all you're doing is just focus on how you feel. You've lost your routine. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. Everybody's different, obviously.
Everyone's different. I don't know is the answer to that one, but I guess it depends on what sort of work you do as well. If you're an office-based person, it's not that tiring.
Whereas if you're a builder,
if you're sort of doing very physical work, you could. But I think they obviously, a big thing people say is don't try new things. So if you've worked and trained for 15 weeks, and then you've suddenly got a whole week off with
and you're
nothing
sitting
to
around a bit
occupy
more
yourself,
and
you think, oh, had I noticed that ache in my thigh before? And you start to get a bit paranoid and a bit worried about things. So I think routine can be really useful.
I agree.
And then halfway through that week, you're just going to do a decent bit of carb loading, which is essentially, there's loads of different things out there about that, but probably the best advice I can give is you probably only need 2, maximum 3 days of it. People will start.
So we're talking about a massive bowl of pasta, or this is on the Wednesday or Thursday.
Where are we from? Sunday run, so probably from Thursday or Friday onwards. Just making sure you're fueling well. You've got a really good amount of carbohydrates with your meals, so that you're topping up muscle reserves, topping up liver reserves, topping up blood reserves the morning of the race.
Whereas the mistake some people make is the night before, they really have a huge carb meal, and it just all sits a bit heavy, doesn't it?
It can do, or the massive bowl of porridge in the morning to get to the start line. And also just remember your sort of when you're going to eat compared to when your event will start, because if you are, say, a 5-hour marathon runner, although the marathon starts at 10 or 10:30, you're probably not going to cross the line until 11:30 by the time they've got through everyone. So that's another hour without food. So think about, okay, do I need to take some top-up snacks with me? I have a nice breakfast, but I will have a couple of bananas with me, or some energy bars or something, just so that you're not an hour in and you're thinking, oh, I'm already feeling a bit lethargic. And it's probably because you didn't eat for 5+ hours before the marathon.
And then you've got to get around 26 miles. The other thing you mentioned there is about nothing new, and I think that's really important throughout the week. So nothing new could relate to, as you say, the morning of the marathon, you decide to suddenly eat porridge and you've never eaten porridge before because you've read it somewhere. Or the Tuesday or the Thursday, you go, well, I'll have a sports massage, and you've never had a sports massage before. Or you start eating one of the gels that you've never used before on a training run. I think that nothing new in that week before, particularly, is so important.
Yeah, I just think why risk it?
Yeah,
You've sort of done all those things. The other classic one I see is people trying new clothing on the day that they didn't realize was going to chafe.
Or get
and then you see them with the horrible bleeding nipples, or they can't run because they've chafed all the inner thigh. And it's sort of, once that happens, you can't do anything about it.
That's a good one to talk about. So when should you choose your kit? How should you choose your kit? And I'm assuming you would agree that you need to be doing 2 or 3 runs with your kit, potentially even a long run.
Yeah, definitely. So in that nothing new, I would be sort of, like I said, a test event's perfect. So if you're with a charity, they normally provide you with some kit, maybe a vest to wear or something like that. Make sure you get that early.
Get your name on it.
And you get your name on it. And you've done a few runs with it that have gone at least over an hour, so you can check if it rubs, if it itches, if it's too hot, anything that's going to get in the way of you sort of being comfortable on the day. And really, as long as you've done that, you should be fine. Footwear, again, if you really like a certain pair of trainers and you've decided very early what you're going to wear, that's fine. Don't then go and buy a brand new pair 3 days before if you want to get a new pair. Or don't
start wearing the same your new pair the week before. Might be the same trainer.
Yeah, but bed them in.
Exactly.
Get like maybe 50 to 100k in them at least, so that they feel comfortable. But it's just simple things when you say them out loud, but very easy with the whole sort of stress of running a marathon to make some silly little errors that end up making your experience not as good as
that you end up regretting. Just talking about trainers, I think we talked about this on the last podcast, but essentially you do need 2 pairs, don't you? To get you through the whole marathon training, or do you think you can do it on?
Yeah, no, I think you do, because if you look at running, if you average,
miles?
You're going to run 5. Depending on what you're going to run, a minimum of probably 500 miles, and some people are going to run comfortably over 1,000. Lots of people are going to run 100 to 200 miles a month marathon training. So
no, but in terms of 500 for when a shoe starts to wear out.
Exactly that. So if you're rotating pairs, and also sometimes it just feels nicer to have a different pair for running your slower runs and your faster runs, and it could potentially have an injury prevention benefit. Difficult to prove, but so there's lots of reasons to rotate shoes, and then just mean when you get to race day, you've got a shoe that you haven't worn out. It's relatively fresh, but worn it, ready to go, and you're sort of. It's another box tick that you're prepared in that area. It's one less thing you're not going to be nagging at the back of your mind, basically.
So then we've got the exhibition. So we all go and get our numbers. I remember, one tip that I heard, which is go and get your number, have a little look around, and then get out. And let's go now 24 hours before the marathon. So we've talked a little bit about it. Nothing new, obviously. Not doing having a good, you're going to be eating carbohydrates the night before, but maybe just nothing crazy. You need to do that a few days before. Any other sort of tips 24 hours before? Certainly maybe around the mental side of it. And really,
I think the mental side of it, again, try not to spend too long constantly thinking about it, because it's mentally exhausting. So set aside some time where you say, okay, the night before I've got 15 minutes, and in that time I'm just going to go through my checklist, check my kit, make sure I'm happy there. So I'm not rushing around looking for my Garmin, I haven't charged it or something like that. Make sure your kit's done. And then you might say, I'm going to have 5 to 10 minutes where I'm actually going to sit and just maybe look back over my training, something that's going to give you a bit of a mental boost, or do a little bit of that visualization.
Watch Rocky.
And then you could watch a motivational movie, or listen to the soundtrack or something like that. But really, that's it. And then one thing I would say is very few people sleep well the night before a marathon, and don't panic about that.
And don't panic about feeling anxious. Everybody feels anxious the day or the night or the week before, don't they?
Exactly that. And so you won't sleep well. You might if you're lucky, but probably won't sleep well. One bad night's sleep doesn't really impair performance. It's multiple bad nights. So in that week, you hopefully will have slept well, and the nearer it's got, you might have got a bit more anxious. But yes, although in the morning you won't wake up feeling maybe the freshest, by the time you get there and the adrenaline kicks in and all that sort of stuff, you're going to be absolutely
But you do
fine.
need to also, and I wouldn't suggest you do this the night before, is look at where you need to meet. Look at your transport. Because that first bit there can be quite a lot of waiting around, can't there? And every race is different. So don't do that on the Saturday. Start planning that a few weeks before or a week before, and make sure you know where you're going, because that's only going to add to the anxiety.
I'd have that plan. The last thing I would check the night or 2 days before, because it's the forecasts in this country are so unreliable. Is that last minute weather? What's it going to be? Is it looking? Because some London marathons and spring marathons are boiling. Some are really quite cold.
Mine was boiling. I was very lucky.
And you need to sort of think about, okay, does my kit still suit those conditions? Do I need to make any changes? So in the prep work, you maybe need to have tried a couple of kits, a
Yeah.
warm weather one and a cool weather one, to
Yeah.
make sure you've got those options. And then, like you said, yeah, check your travel. Just be sort of prepared in that. So in the morning, there's as few things as possible that you've got to sort of think or go over, basically.
And so you've just started the race.
Yeah.
You've been running a mile before you even get through the start gates or walking.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts around running with somebody? Let's start with that, because friends, you get security running together, don't you?
Yeah.
You support each other.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts around that?
Well, I think you're either going to run with a friend or family member or a pacing group.
Yeah.
Now, pacing groups, if that's what you've trained for, then I think they're
So just
really
explain
useful.
what that is for people.
So a pacing group, most bigger marathons they'll either have a banner or a balloon, and it will say on it 3 hours.
And that's someone
15.
running around
And
doing
that person's going to run fairly equal halves, so what we call equal splits of the marathon, and they're going to come in pretty reliably at the time on that banner, basically.
Yeah.
So if they're a 4-hour banner and you want to run 4 hours, then sticking in or near that person absolutely makes sense. It just helps. It depends if you like that sort of thing, because they can be quite congested areas because lots of people latch on to those people. And if you started a few minutes behind and you sprint to catch up to that, then again, that early sprint, you might not think of it as much, but it can just take a little bit more out of you than you'd expect. So if you're in the right place for that person and it makes sense for you, you could run with them. Running with family, I think if you're both going for the same time and your training's very similar, why not? Absolutely.
But be prepared to leave each other,
have a
I would
plan,
say.
Yeah, have a plan.
Don't be offended if you leave.
If I'm struggling or if you're struggling, we're going to separate. I don't want you sort of having a terrible time because I hit a wall at mile 18 and had to walk the rest, and you walked out of politeness with me. If that's your plan, we'll split off if we are suddenly starting to look like we're running very different paces. Basically. But I think running with people absolutely fine.
Yeah, cool. Well, we've covered an awful lot. I'm going to give you a few bits of quick fire here.
Okay.
So, this might go out on, careful what you say. So, what do you think of yoga for runners?
Absolutely fine. It's sort of, I see yoga as a combination of mobility and strength work. I don't think and this could upset yoga people, but I don't think the way it strengthens is necessarily the way I'd want a runner to strengthen. Yeah. But if you want to use it as part of your overall week and you get lots of different things from it, then you can use it absolutely fine.
If I want to prevent a running injury, should I stretch a region or strengthen a region? Or both?
So if you've got time for both, you could do both. There's no good research for stretching and injury prevention. Like I said earlier, there's reasonable research for strengthening and injury prevention outside of runners, and maybe some emerging stuff in runners if you're adherent to it. So if I had to choose one, I'm choosing strengthening. If you like stretching for other reasons, like for recovery or just as part of a mental process of winding down or sort of recovering from exercise, use it. But for injury prevention, I don't think we can confidently say it does that.
What do you think of foam rollers?
Similar thing. The sort of only good research suggests they're good for post-exercise muscle soreness. So if that's what you're using one for, absolutely. They might temporarily improve joint motion as well, which for a runner you don't really need. So more of a recovery tool on top of the basics of sleep and nutrition. And if you like using it, absolutely use it.
If I was a new runner and you could give me 3 tips to choose the right trainers for me, what would they be?
If you're completely unsure, I would suggest probably going and getting some form of assistance, either from a good reputable shoe shop or a podiatrist. I would say the phrase is comfort is king. Comfort is king. You're going to run a long distance in these trainers. They need to feel comfortable on your feet. And I would say weight of a shoe is probably quite important as well, especially for longer distance. They make quite a difference if you've got a 220 gram shoe versus a 350 gram shoe over 4 hours. That is a lot of extra energy to move. So comfortable, lightweight, and do your research. Have a little look into sort of what reviews say for these shoes for the event you're training for. Because these days, trainers are very event specific. You'll find event trainers that are much more suited for marathons versus 10Ks versus 5Ks.
Excellent. How does sports massage fit into a marathon training program?
So I think it's going to be really useful. And again, it sits there in that recovery pyramid. So at the base of that pyramid is sleep, good nutrition, hydration, stress management as best you can. And then sitting above that is potentially things like contrast bathing and hot and cold and stuff like that. And then sitting above that is massage and soft tissue treatments and things like that. So absolutely can be part of your overall recovery process as long as you're getting the base of the pyramid done. But I have lots of clients that use it, and you're putting your body through a lot. So anything that you can do to help you on that recovery side of things, I think can add real value. So yeah, simply for me, I think as long as you're doing the basics of recovery, add in whatever works for you on top of that.
What do you think of ice baths, and how do they fit into training for a marathon?
Yeah, so again, there's a real craze at the moment because companies have started selling the ones you can get at home and just make a little thing. Um, the research isn't there yet. You sort of, if you look at it, it doesn't necessarily suggest that it has a very clear and obvious performance benefit. It might have a recovery benefit, but you have to think too cold, you might be blocking or delaying the body's natural inflammatory recovery responses. So very individualistic, I think. Some people will find it really works and some people won't. But I would say don't jump on it because you've just seen all your friends doing it. I would say, again, do your research. If you're going to want to try one, maybe try a friend's and see if you really, and if you want to go down that road, you can. And we've sort of gone from ice baths at home to buying these home plunge pools. And there are lots of places now for cryotherapy, which, again, it all falls out of the elite sports world. Eventually, often, maybe some research does follow it, but it's sort of.
But there's so much you can do without doing that for a good recovery.
I think there's things to do before we get there, basically.
Yeah, perfect. What do you think are the 3 biggest training errors for somebody that's running a marathon?
So rule of twos, essentially. Too much, too often, too fast, essentially. And normally it's the too fast one. If you look at people, everyone talks about it, but still people get it wrong. They run their easy runs too hard, essentially. And it's because of maybe social sites comparisons, and they want to, when they upload it, they want it to look good or whatever, or people just feel that they should run faster to get fitter, and they just can't buy into the fact that slower running would serve them better. But yeah, the biggest one for me is running what should be slow and easy runs too fast. And then the other one is sort of too much too soon. So suddenly jumping from 2 runs a week to 5 runs a week, or suddenly jumping from 20 miles a week to 40 miles a week with no gradual progression, and it just overloads your body.
Is it important to run on a variety of terrains, or should you always run on grass or concrete? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I always think variation definitely can be protective, because it just means we're slightly shifting forces around. We'll run on trail, we'll run with shorter stride lengths, we'll have much more variation because we're running around corners and up and down hills. Grass is softer. When you run on softer surface, you sort of stiffen things up a little bit through your muscles. And when you run on harder surfaces, your muscles relax. So you have some more sort of shock absorption through the joints. So variety means different structures are getting stressed in different ways. So if you've got the option to vary, great. If you just don't have the option, don't panic over it, but just bear that in mind as your mileage goes.
Everybody seems to be getting Theraguns. What do you think of Theraguns at the moment?
I think Theraguns are just the next foam roller. Everyone had foam rollers, and they still have them tucked under their bed or in their cupboards. And now that Theraguns have sort of dropped from 500 quid to 80 quid, people are getting Theraguns. And again, it's a recovery tool. Absolutely fine to use. I would put it in the same area as foam rollers. You can use it for post-exercise soreness. And I would sit it more in that after exercise than as a warm-up tool, basically.
One of the main injuries that we see with runners during marathon training is stress fractures. So the most common ones will be the tibia, the shin bone, the metatarsal, so the bones in the foot. If a runner was concerned about a stress fracture, give me 3 things they should look out for that may indicate that they've got a stress fracture, and obviously they should go and get medical attention.
So we alluded to it a bit earlier. Normally it will be a pain that's there from the off in the run and builds and gets more uncomfortable, and it'll be very localized. So they'll be able to say it's an area that they can point to, as opposed to it's my whole shin or something like that. It will often be impact related. So if we get them in the clinic and we ask them to hop, that will reproduce their symptoms, and they can obviously hop at home and test that. And if you've got pain with every hop on takeoff and landing, that's a little bit concerning. And if you can palpate that bone, then often there is a small area that is exquisitely tender that we'll find. And again, if you can palpate where your pain is, you can often find that bit yourself, basically. So yeah, they would be my probably 3 most easiest recognizable symptoms.
Well, that was brilliant, Alex. That's an awful lot of information for people to listen to, and hopefully they find it useful. So thanks very much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Look forward to the next one. Cheers.